region, this call for change, the peaceful protests that marked the beginning of what later turned into an armed revolt, and what has happened to those people in the period since, and how we've seen a kind of an atomizing, if you like, of the opposition forces, and particularly the armed element of the opposition forces. And certainly my experience on the ground recently in northern Syria, and you know, there are huge swathes of northern Syria that are now essentially under rebel control. I don't even like saying under rebel control, because that's almost gives the sense that the rebels are controlling the people in those areas. These are areas where the flag of the opposition forces fly. There's a sense that people are getting back to their ordinary lives, but there's a sense that the regime is gone from these areas and will never return to these areas again. So what I found interesting about that was a sense that in northern Syria, Bashar al-Assad seems in many respects to have lost the people, and I don't know how he's going to ever regain that again. And it's important to point out that in northern Syria, the areas are predominantly Sunni. I mean, north of Aleppo, you have a couple of Alawite, a couple of Shia villages, but it's predominantly Sunni Muslim. So you don't have the more complicated dynamic that you had in places like Homs, in Dera, in Fitzgerald, for example, where there was far more of a sectarian mix. But just going back to that idea that as the months have dragged on, and as the violence has taken a particularly brutal turn on both sides, I think it's fair to say. I mean, we heard from the UN Commission of Inquiry last week, which held government forces and the pro-Assad militia known as Shabih as being responsible for the Kula massacre, in which more than 100 civilians, most of them women and children, were killed earlier this year. But of course, this report also talked about how the rebel forces were guilty of war crimes, though it did point out that the level of gravity of these war crimes on the rebel side wasn't as much as on the government side. So we're at a stage now where, I mean, my overwhelming sense in northern Syria was that this was no longer a fight for change as such. It was increasingly a conflict that is driven by the need for revenge. So I was hearing about Dera, I was hearing about what was happening in Homs, I was hearing what was happening within families to their relatives, their men in particular. Revenge seemed to be pushing a lot of what's going on now.
I mean, the regime has caused this uprising. The regime has caused this militarization of the uprising. There's only so much people can take before they will pick up guns and try and fight back. You know, it's human nature, I guess. I think to a large degree, this revolution has been hijacked by a number of other elements. At its core, it was a peaceful movement. People who wanted, you know, we have to remember, it began by people calling for reforms and for dignity. And of course, it changed quickly that people started to vote the regime because of how the regime reacted to these protests. You know, the focus today is on the armed conflict, rightly or wrongly. There's very little kind of talk and interest in the peaceful protesters. They're almost like a sideshow of what's happening now. You know, that I guess in itself is inevitable. But it seems to be hijacked because you have everyone has a kind of a peace, wants to have a peace in Syria. You have an increasing number of Islamist groups inside the country. You have the homegrown, for the most part, homegrown Muslim Brotherhood, which, if we're to believe some of the Telegraph reports, they have their own armed group operating inside the country. You have Al-Qaeda and so on. So for the people who started this revolution, who wanted kind of, you know, they want to change, I guess for the most part, through the process of some sort, you know, they're kind of left holding their hands up and kind of thinking, what can we do? There's a very good article by Abu Dhabi-based, the national newspaper based in Abu Dhabi, whereby this guy, this protester, had been imprisoned for protesting months ago. He came out of jail recently. All his friends had picked up guns and were now rebels. So he was like, you know, what happened to our movement? We were calling for something very different the last time I was out. But he felt, at the end of the article, he felt that, you know, I have to join my friends, I'm going to pick up a gun, and so on. And you know, I mean, from the beginning, the regime's tactics were just, you know, self-defeating. Because at one stage last summer, I was walking, I got a taxi or a microbus, kind of a small minibus, into the city centre. And I got off outside the Damascus University faculty for economics. And I was walking along, kind of in my own world, I don't know, thinking about something, whatever. And this impromptu demonstration started up outside the university. Excuse me. It lasted all of about 2 seconds before these security guys and police came from nowhere. Now these were students, these were young guys and young women. They had no guns, they had no weapons, they were holding up some flags and some paper. But the way that the government reacted to what they were doing is really illustrative of their overall kind of, you know, reaction to what's happening. They say they've implemented reforms, they say they've had referendum on the constitution, they've had elections and so on. You know, I've seen it with my own eyes, their reaction to these people who call for, you know, I mean, I think what they were calling for was freedom, and they were saying, God is great.
Yeah, I think, you know, that sense that this is something that people have been plunged into, you know, this idea. I mean, I met several army defectors who had joined the ranks of the rebel forces, but also a lot of people who have never picked up weapons in their lives. As one rebel commander I met who had first picked up a gun a number of months ago, he worked in a profession before that. He said, please remember, none of us likes war, but the circumstances we found ourselves in that part of Syria forced us to become soldiers, and that's how he justified what he's done. I just want to unpick a little bit. You know, you mentioned the kind of changing dynamics now of that armed conflict on the rebel side, and you know, we're seeing increasingly elements coming into Syria from outside. We're seeing homegrown elements that would have had affiliations to Al-Qaeda dating back from the stage during the Iraq War, where the Syrian regime in many cases encouraged that, and Syria was a staging post for Al-Qaeda fighters coming to Iraq. So now you're getting this kind of toxic mix within Syria, which, I mean, certainly people I met in northern Syria, they were very much torn about the new elements coming into the armed uprising. I heard people deny that there were any foreign fighters in Syria at all, and I had said, well, I've met several of them. Because I think they had a sense that they knew how this narrative was very much tying in with the regime narrative, that, and the regime, as representatives have said many times, that most of the rebel fighters are foreigners linked with Al-Qaeda, so I think they were very sensitive about that. But also there was a sense that some of these foreigners may be bringing in their own agenda, which Syrians see as alien to the Syrian context. So you have now that toxic mix bubbling away, and the rebel forces themselves atomizing. I mean, my overwhelming impression on the ground was that for all the talk of the so-called Free Syrian Army, it means everything and nothing. It's a generic term now that is quite meaningless, because most of the rebel units I met pledge no fealty to the FSA. They see the nominal leaders of the FSA sitting in Turkey. I heard the complaint many times, where are they? They're army defectors. They're sitting in Turkey drinking tea. They should be here on the ground, you know, helping us coordinate. So there's a dangerous splintering now of the rebel forces.
For sure. I mean, it suits the rebels to an extent that they're not that organised as an army.
Stand up.
Could you please stand up?
Yeah.
Thank you.
It suits the rebel movement to an extent that they're not very well coordinated with other parts, with other battalions and companies and other rebel movements across the country, because they can use these guerrilla tactics and they can hit and run. They can operate independently. They're not waiting for you know, directions or orders from, as you say, this guy in Turkey. What is frightening, I guess, is when, and I'll go on record and say that the regime will fall. When the regime falls, you have this, you have a kind of a traditional political opposition of Syrians who lived in the country for a very long time and work as human rights lawyers and so on. For the most part, they're outside the country, and they form the SNC, the Syrian National Council. And you have the rebels inside the country who are living and dying for this revolution. When the regime falls, how are they going to reconcile the differences? The political opposition, because they've had this position for a very long time and they're recognised as opposition to the Bashar al-Assad regime, they will feel like it's their place to take up the positions of the presidency or ministerial positions and so on. But the rebels have, as I say, they've lived and died for this revolution. They're going to want a piece of the pie as well. They're going to want kind of powerful positions, be it in the army or maybe in the government and so on. So this is just one, it's just one kind of facet of what happens next. So it's getting messier by the day. I think an interview with, I think it was the Telegraph, Bashar al-Assad made last October, he said that if foreign elements and foreign countries get involved in Syria, it will become 10 Afghanistan. And at the time, everyone kind of laughed, this is going to be rhetoric and so on. We're not kind of, we can't take what he's saying very seriously. But each day I think of his statement, and it's becoming worse and worse. And what he's saying is actually, it's heading that direction.
I'd like to ask you, Stephen, about one part of the narrative we hear a lot of on Syria is that this is an increasingly sectarian civil war. It's taken on an increasingly sectarian tone. This has been part of the regime narrative from early on, and the regime has tried to inject a sectarian element to what's going on. I was struck in my conversations with Syrian refugees I met in Lebanon, Syrian refugees I met in Turkey, as well as Syrians I met on the ground in northern Syria, the extent to which they resisted that narrative. Now, whether they were resisting that narrative because they felt that they were talking to a foreign journalist is another question. But they were saying, no, please understand that this is not a huge element of this. I mean, there were some people I asked, some Sunnis I asked them if they could see themselves being able to live with their Alawite neighbours in the future. Some of them said, no, absolutely not, after what happened. But for the most part, people were resisting that sectarian narrative. How much do you think this has a sectarian element?
I mean, all the activists I met say that we have no problem with Christians, we have no problem with Alawis, we just have a problem with Bashar al-Assad and his family. Inevitably these activists in the first place are Sunni Muslims. For the most part, they're not Christians, and they weren't Alawis. You go and speak to a group of Christians, and they have a very different point of view. And I would say to some of the Christians I know, at least, Syria is a very old country. It's got a long and distinguished history. The Assad regime has only been in power for 40 years, which is something very, it's a very, very short period on the overall time frame, I guess. And that Syria was a country before the Assads took power, and that there was peace, and that there were Christians. There was a Christian prime minister back in the 50s, I believe. And that Syria has a track record of kind of secularism and so on. As I say, you go and speak to Christians, and they say, look at the videos that we see on TV. They're all shouting Allahu Akbar, which means God is great. Christians use this term as well in everyday life. But when they hear it on TV, they seem to attach some kind of religious kind of affiliation to this, unfortunately. And it's almost like it's inevitable that, speaking of the rebels, they're fighting a much superior army. And I guess it's inevitable that they turn to God for support or for whatever, like people across the world do. And when they see him on TV or on videos shouting God is great and so on, it's almost like that. I guess it's inevitable that this happens. For the Christians, they're scared stiff of what they see and so on. And we also, my experience of the country is that the Christians live together, they socialize together, obviously they go to church together and so on. There's, I won't say very little interaction, but there's very little kind of close interaction. Very few Christians I know would invite their Muslim friends over coffee or tea or dinner and so on. Christians I know are generally speaking here now, I hate to generalize, some of the Christians I know spoke in kind of derogatory terms of Muslims and so on. And
But in terms of, the Alawite Sunni dynamic, often hear that this is a Sunni-led uprising against a regime that is dominated by an Alawite minority. The dynamic there, particularly because the extent to which the Shabiha, which is the pro-Assad religion, tends to be Alawites, the extent to which they are now blamed for some of the worst excesses on the regime side. How much of a corrosive effect is that having on the fabric of Syrian society if we're looking forward to what comes after Bashar al-Assad?
The longer the status quo continues, the more difficult it's going to be to put the country back together again. If the regime, for example, was to fall tomorrow, it would be somewhat easier than in months down the road when it seems likely that the regime will fall. The reason the majority of protesters are Sunni is that the majority of the population of the country is Sunni. And, in my opinion, at least, is that the core of this revolution is based on economics. That back in, to give a little bit of background, I guess, from 2008 to 2010, there was a drought that forced almost a million people, mostly farmers and labourers, off the